Gonzaga's inability to take Ryan Nembhard off the floor in close games has been an issue all season long, but what can be done to fix it? We're going to discuss three options right here on the Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, folks. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. All right, folks, we are joined today by Matthew Walter. Later in the show, he is a WCC women's basketball writer, also covers the Pac-12. He's here to discuss Lisa Fortier's team, how far this team can go, whether they're going to win out. Some more conversation about Yvonne Ejim as well. Fantastic stuff from Matthew in this show. But first, before we get to that, we're going to answer one mailbag question about Ryan Nembhard that I got shortly after I recorded the post-game show after Saturday night's loss to UW. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about this point guard situation for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. What can be done about the fact that Nembhard and Hickman are playing basically every minute this season after the loss of Steel Venters. There's no free agency. You don't get a midseason pickup. I know the Memphis Tigers just picked up Naquan Tomlin out of Kansas State. That is a unique situation. Players transferring at midseason and being immediately eligible basically never happens. So that is not a solution for Gonzaga. We'll talk about what some of those solutions might be. But first, let's get to this mailbag question here from Dawson via Gmail. Dawson asks, is Ryan Nembhard too out of control? I've had that thought throughout the season, but it really seemed like a problem against UW. There were multiple times he used push-offs to create shots because of his lack of size instead of creating for others. Also, multiple times he seemed to force something going to the rim. Gonzaga typically has very cerebral point guards, so Nembhard's aggressiveness is taking some time to get used to. Yeah, I wouldn't say Nembhard is not cerebral. I don't know if that's the direct correlation here, but Nembhard's an incredibly intelligent point guard, and I don't think that him being aggressive is necessarily a lack of being cerebral for that matter. I also think that, so the answer is simple. The answer to the question overall is Nembhard too out of control, et cetera, et cetera. All of the issues for Ryan Nembhard effectively come down to two things. One, he's playing too many minutes. Most of the time, you find Nembhard struggling, you find him struggling in the second half. He basically played 30 great minutes against UW and then 10 bad minutes at the end of the game. That's true for almost everybody on Gonzaga's team for that matter, but it was particularly true for Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman. Nolan Hickman's not drawing the same criticism because he had a great scoring first half, but he made a very critical turnover at the end of the game for Gonzaga in that UW game as well. So it's not like this is all on Nembhard. He's trying to do too much is part of it because he's being asked to do too much. I think that's kind of an element too. Steel Venters, the injury there, not only took away some of Gonzaga's guard depth, but it also took away some of their shooting, some of their scoring. I think Nembhard felt like he needed to step into more of a scoring role. I don't know what the coaching staff is telling him, how that communication is going, but I think that the situation with Nembhard is playing too many minutes, being asked to do too much. Hopefully those things will change. That's what we're going to talk about momentarily. I would also say that the eye test and the stats don't exactly match up in some ways here. The implication that Nembhard is forcing things at the rim and not distributing the basketball, he's averaging 5.7 assists per game. That is a career high. He never topped 5 per game in his first 2 seasons at Creighton. 5.7 assists per game. And say, oh, well, he's playing more minutes. He's not, actually. In 10 games, in the first 10 games of Gonzaga season, Nembhard is averaging 33.7 minutes per game. He averaged over 34 minutes per game in each of his first 2 seasons at Creighton. To be clear, that is a misleading stat. I do not want to imply that, oh, Nembhard's playing like he is playing less in the sense that he has played less minutes per game, but he is playing every minute of games against good teams. He's playing every minute in 3 consecutive games for the Purdue, Syracuse, and UCLA game. And then he's playing way less minutes against teams like Mississippi Valley State and Arkansas Pine Bluff. So the numbers there don't really add up. But in terms of using per game statistics, Nembhard averages 5.7 assists per game in 33.7 minutes. That is a better rate than he did in either of his first 2 seasons at Creighton. He's also shooting 48.1% on 2-pointers. Last year at Creighton, he shot 48.2. So his efficiency around the rim, his efficiency on 2-point shots, his ability to distribute the basketball are all the same or better than they were at Creighton, implying that this is basically who Ryan Nembhard is, with one incredibly key difference. Nembhard is shooting 19.4% on the season from 3. That is horrendously worse than he did at Creighton. His first year at Creighton, he wasn't great. He was like 31%. Last year was 35.5%. Ryan Nembhard is not a 19.5% three-point shooter. He's not. He's going to improve in that area. Again, I think some of the fatigue is a factor for him there. And it's also just maybe an early season slump. We're 10 games in, so we're about a third of the way through the season. So you gotta hope that stuff starts to turn around here soon. But Nembhard does have 2.8 turnovers per game, but he averaged 3 turnovers per game as a freshman in 34 minutes. So again, I think that eye test has certainly, especially late in games, we've seen Nembhard not look like the player we expected or wanted or had, aspirations of him being. But I think a lot of that is just fatigue related. And I don't think it's necessarily something that merits a lot of panic or concern about Nembhard going forward. But it does point to a situation of like, how are we going to solve this? And I see 3 ways that Gonzaga can solve this problem. Option 1, and we've talked about all 3 of these before. Those of you who are everyday listeners, you will have heard these options in terms of getting Nembhard more or less playing time. Option 1 is to play more minutes of Jun Seok Yeo at the 3 while sliding Dusty Stromer down to the 2. If Dusty's playing the 2 and Yeo is playing the 3, that means one of Nembhard or Hickman is on the bench. So you could slide Hickman down to the 1, have Nembhard be on the bench, or play Nembhard, have Hickman get a break. Either way, those 2 guards both need breaks. Dusty needs breaks too, but this is at least a way to keep Dusty on the floor, have Yeo on the floor, and get one of the other guards a break. I like this because it gives Gonzaga a ton of defensive flexibility. If you have a lineup with Graham Ike, Anton Watson, Jun Seok Yeo, Dusty Stromer, all on the floor at the same time, your length, your defensive intensity is top-notch. You're stopping everybody. Teams are not going to score on that lineup. The problem is Gonzaga's offense is probably going to stall out. Yeo and Stromer are not consistent offensive contributors to this team. I love what Dusty Stromer has brought. He has not brought offensive consistency. At times, he has not brought offense at all. It's gone 0 points, 2 points over an entire 38, 40-minute game. He's not missing a whole bunch of shots. He might go 0 for 4, 0 for 3, but that's the point. He's not bringing a lot of offense. Yeo is not either. I think he will in time. We saw glimpses of it in that game on Monday against Mississippi Valley State. So I think you're going to start to see more of that from him. But this lineup, while it gives Nembhard and or Hickman a break, it stalls out offensively a little bit. And then option 2 is kind of the same. So I'm going to include it here. And that's 3 big lineups. That's where you have 3 of the 4 bigs between E.K. Watson, Ben Gregg, and Braden Huff. 3 of those guys on the floor at the same time. You slide, again, same thing. You slide Dusty down to the 2, and then you play either Nembhard or Hickman at the 1. You could, in theory, if you wanted to go mega jumbo, you could play Yeo at the 2 along with 3 bigs. I don't think we're going to see that this year. I just don't think that offense really fits what Gonzaga wants to do. But certainly it is at least an option they could play with. Again, the pros here are great. I think that Ben Gregg and Watson have proven the ability to, and Huff for that matter, have proven the ability to space the floor. Really, EK has too, although I think you'd rather have him down on the block. But you can space the floor still with this. The offense, I think, still functions well in the fact that you can, you're not clogging the paint necessarily. You're not going to get out in transition as much. And I think that is a con for Gonzaga. Frankly, Nembhard not being able to run as much might actually help in terms of his ability to be less fatigued at the end of games. I worry about this team defensively with 3 big lineups. We've seen it in spurts and in 4 to 6 minute periods of time. I think it's good, but running it longer defensively, I think would be problematic. Greg is a great hustle guy on defense, but he's not great at defending out in space. He's not great. He's not a great perimeter defender. He hasn't been asked to be a perimeter defender, so that's not his fault. But suddenly asking him to guard threes is going to be a challenge. Watson can do it. and is good at it. But if Watson is having to play perimeter defense, it takes him away from his better skills, in help side defense on the paint, getting out in passing lanes, doing that stuff. If you're asking him to play a more specific defensive role, you just take away some of the skills that he has. And then the third option is, of course, more Luka Krajnovic. It's the option we've been clamoring for the most on this podcast. But if we're being honest, up to this point, he hasn't earned more minutes. He did not come to campus until early September. That was just when everything kind of lined up for him to get to Spokane. So he's still learning the offense. He's still learning the speed, the pace, how Division I college basketball works, how the referees work. We see him commit fouls that I think he's surprised are called fouls just because it's different. It's officiated differently in Europe. So I think a lot of his struggles are not talent issues. They're not fit issues even necessarily. They're just like still growing and developing and still understanding the system. And that's a good thing for his long-term development, but it's kind of a bad thing for his short-term development because you don't fix those things overnight. Like that, it takes time. So the expectation that Luka will be a big-time contributor somewhat suddenly and all of a sudden be playing 15 minutes a game, I was hopeful for it early in the year, and I'm less hopeful about it now. Not because of anything he has done or hasn't done, just because I think that the growth, the development that needs to happen for him to be ready to contribute is something that I think will happen. I just don't think it's going to happen in a timeline that necessarily lines up with getting Gonzaga more help this year. And that's okay for him, but it's a problem for Gonzaga. It's a problem. Ryan Nembhard's playing too many minutes. You're seeing him fatigue down the stretch. It's happened with Hickman as well. And I wish there was a more obvious solution. I hope that we see more of Yeo at the 3 and Dusty at the 2. That is what I am pushing for personally, because I think that makes the most sense as a logical solution. But we'll have to see what Mark Few sees. He's seen a lot more than I am, folks. So he's going to have a better sense of what's going to work with this team. But without there magically being a free agent point guard who just pops up that they can sign, which is not how college basketball works, at least not yet. There's kind of hamstrung on how many options they have to fix this year. We'll talk more about this topic. It's going to continue to come up as we get it further into the season and see how Nembhard performs against teams like UConn and San Diego State and whatnot. But it's going to be a recurring theme throughout the season. Well, Matthew Walter joins us coming up to discuss the Lady Zags, their win over Stanford, and their upcoming non-conference matchups. All that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. As the weather gets colder, the college basketball offers stay hot on FanDuel. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time than right now to get in on the action. The app is super easy to use. There is a wide range of betting options, which include spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. And right now, Gonzaga is down to -220 to win the WCC. That is their odds right now. Look, I know they struggled against struggled against UW, but Gonzaga's still winning the WCC. Nobody else is stepping up for that one. So if you want to get some easy money, head to FanDuel.com/lockedon and get in on the action this college basketball season. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Well, I'm thrilled to be joined today by Matthew Walter. Matthew covers the WCC and the Pac-12 for The Next, a women's basketball website started by Howard Megdal, one of the hosts of the great Locked On Women's Basketball podcast. Matthew's joined me a couple of times here on Locked On Zags over the years, and we got a lot to discuss today about Coach Lisa Fortier's program here. Fantastic win over Stanford. And I want to start there. This is a monumental program type win for the Zags, hosting Stanford at home. Worst loss Stanford has had in about 4 years. It was an 18-point victory for the Zags. Yeah, Cameron Brink was hurt. She left the game early. I know that that's a factor into the game, but I don't know. I don't think she was going to make a 20-point difference. It looked like the Zags just absolutely handled them in this one. I think they dropped 96. Before we get into, some of the other logistical stuff, the net rankings, various other things on this women's basketball program, what did you think about that game over Stanford?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the advantage that Gonzaga has is they play this matchup every year, right? This is something that's pretty consistent for the Zags. And I think they went into this game right because last year they went down to Stanford. They had a bunch of injuries, a bunch of sickness. They able to full game plan. And we're going to talk about this later, but just the roster continuity of they know how they want to play Stanford. They know how they want to guard, right? You've got Brennan Maxwell, who played at Utah for 3 or 4 years. She knows
Mhm.
what Stanford has. And I think playing them every year, just like it's not like it's a new opponent that you've only played once in the last
Mhm.
4 or 5 years. And it just gives you consistency of knowing your opponent, number one. Number two, you're right. Like not having Cameron Brink in the second half
Mhm.
doesn't help Stanford. But
Mhm.
I think just you talk about the balance, right? You got
Mhm.
27 from Yvonne Ejim and then 27 from Brenna Maxwell, but you got
Yeah.
10 from Kaylin, 10 from Eliza, you got 15 from Maud off the bench. It's just there's a lot of weapons on this team, and you have so many different ways of attacking people with this group that they have on the floor. And they did a really good job on making the life tough for the Stanford, stars. Like, yes,
Mhm.
Aaron Brink didn't play, only had 10 points in her 11 minutes. Kiki Uriafen had gotten off to a really strong start to the year. She only had 10. She was in foul trouble. Hannah Jump, who's one of the best shooters in the country, only had 13. You limited her to 5 3-point shots. And Gonzaga just does what they do. They make games difficult for their opponents. They play strong defense, and they got a really good offensive showing. They made 10 threes,
Mhm.
which is really, really hard to stop someone making 10 threes in any game, but especially at home where Gonzaga is able to really dominate at times and take advantage of that crowd that it's not a big arena, but it gets full. And when it gets full, it gets loud, and that makes it really hard for other teams. And they knew they needed to get one big win to sort of solidify their non-conference, and they'd missed a couple of opportunities early. And I think they went in this game hungry because, again, they had beaten Stanford before. Lisa Fortier, that's not new territory. They've beaten the Cardinal before, but I think that hadn't happened since this group of kids, this group of players had been there. And I think they were hungry with a lot of seniors on this team to get this win, and they came in and they executed the game plan at a very high level.
Talked a bit about those two losses that I'm sure Gonzaga would like to have back. Those were two road game to Washington State early in the season, and then a loss to Louisville on a neutral site. But the Zags also have 10 wins in the non-conference so far. They got wins over Alabama, win over Cal, win over Rice that they recently picked up. Obviously, the win over Stanford. And we had this conversation last year, Matthew, and I know that it's a huge storyline for Gonzaga, for them in the WCC right now, especially with BYU's departure, is you really need to have a strong non-conference schedule, need to have a strong showing in the net ranking, need to avoid any bad losses, particularly as they get into conference play. And right now, just snapshot of Gonzaga's resume, 10-2 record with that win over Stanford, with two losses. Again, they'd like to have back, but certainly neither of them are bad losses. Where does this team stack up? They're 13th in the net ranking. They're probably not the 13th best team in the country necessarily, but where do you kind of see them right now with the experience they have, with the way that they've performed up to this point in the season?
Yeah, I think coming into the season, I had them as a 20 to 25th type of team in the country, right there, one of the top 25 teams, but they weren't maybe top 20. And I said, we'll see, right? We have all this returning consistency, all this returning minutes. Who's going to get better, right? Where are we going to see growth, right? You get Kaylee back from injury now. She's getting a little bit more back to her speed. And I think to me now, in my mind, they're a top 16 to 20 team, right? They're in that next sort of range. And I think the two reasons why they've gotten better, number one, Yvonne Ejim has taken another step. She's went from an all conference player to she might be one of the best players in the country.
Yeah.
Like just super talented, super athletic, but her development between year to year to year to year has taken such big steps for her and for the team, right? And now I was talking to assistant coach Craig Fortier on a story I'm working on about Yvonne actually, and she said the game is just slowing down for her, right? She's finally starting to really see it at a really high level. And then they just have such good players on the team that know when to get her the ball. And she has such a good combination of athleticism and strength. It's one of the few players I've watched who can run the floor and also just beat people at the same time. And then I also think the growth of Eliza Hollingsworth, right? Like there were 4 starters returning. You lose Michaela Williams, who is that 3-and-D guard. So now you just need someone to fill it, just give you a couple of more points a game. And Hollingsworth averaging double digits. She's doing a good job on the board. She's spacing the floor with her shooting, which works great with Ejim, who wants to play inside. Hollingsworth can play it on the perimeter. And that gives the Zags sort of a 2-level front court, right? You can get Ejim on the inside, you get Hollingsworth on the outside, and we know that the Trong twins and Brenna can all shoot the ball. So now you've got this very nice floor spacing for round one, and it works to the Zags' advantage. And just the growth of those two, right? Yvonne taking the step to becoming a superstar, and Hollingsworth becoming this more solid role player instead of just sort of getting some moments here and there. And then they're getting, good contributions off the bench from different people on different nights. Maud Hudgens one night, you get something from Callie Stokes, something from Esther Little. They're getting a little bit of something from what they need. And I think having a group that returns so much, everybody knows their role, right? No one's going into any game going, what am I supposed to do tonight? No, everybody knows what they're supposed to do, and they execute it at a really high level. And I don't think they really care who has 20 and who has 5. Like, they're the kind of team that, we thought Yvonne can have 27, and then another night Brenna can have 20, and then another night Kaylee can do it, and Kaylin can do it, and Eliza can do it. And that's what makes them so good, is they all just want to win. And I don't think they really care about who's scoring 20, who's having the big game, who's conference player of the week, who's conference player of the year. They just want to win, because they want to show the world who Gonzaga is, because they had that sort of down year last year to their own standards.
Well, the Zags are 10-2, hoping to get to 13-2 before they get into the WCC season. 3 more non-conference games as we record here. They got South Dakota State, Arizona, and New Mexico. Do we think that this team can win all 3 of these games? All 3 of these teams are lower than them in the net ranking. Arizona is a top 100 team. South Dakota State is a top 100 team in the net right now. New Mexico, not so great. So kind of a chance to finish out the non-conference, continuing on this strong note. And then kind of beyond that, do you think that they have to win all 3 of these games? Like this, we'll talk more about the WCC momentarily, but it still feels like Gonzaga is in a spot where there's just not that much wiggle room with the conference. We saw it last year where they dropped 1 game in the regular season they shouldn't drop, and they dropped the WCC championship, and it really hurt them in a seeding perspective. Does that feel like still kind of the situation that Fortier's team is in, or have they kind of put themselves in a bit of a better spot, particularly with the Stanford win?
I would say they need these 3 games. If they had won one of the Louisville or Washington State game, I would say you could probably afford to lose to Arizona, but that's it. You can't afford to lose to South Dakota State and New Mexico. And it's not because, especially South Dakota State, who's a very good team, but you really only want to lose games to you see yourself as a Power 5 program. I think that's how Lisa Fortier approaches the way that she schedules her non-conference. You can't lose to non-Power 5 teams. You have to beat the teams that are even though South Dakota State's one of the better mid-major programs in the country, that's a game you should come at home and win that game. Yeah. They should beat Arizona, but the thing is that game is in Arizona. It's a neutral site game in Arizona. Arizona is a very young team compared to Gonzaga, who's very experienced. I believe that Gonzaga is the better team, but again, you're going to a neutral site game in somebody else's state for a big time matchup against a Power 5 program. Not saying that they're not going to be prepared, but those are the games like against Louisville and Texas, like going down, in state to Washington State. Those are the games that can sort of be toss-ups. And if you don't play your best or something happens, you're not going to win that game. So yes, they need to win all 3 of these games, because they need as many top 100 net wins as they can grab in the non-conference, because there are limited opportunities to get them in conference play. They're not going to get an advantage like Alabama or Louisville or Stanford or Arizona or any of the other Power 5 teams that they played in the non-conference, where they're going to play a top 100 net team almost every night in conference play. Almost every night those teams play really high-quality teams. That's not going to happen for Gonzaga. They're only going to get maybe 4 of those games out of their conference play.
Closing out the show today, looking ahead to the WCC season for Coach Lisa Fortier's team. We're also going to continue to talk about the dominance of Yvonne Ejim this year. All that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You all want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best and most qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, which helps find the right people for your team faster, and they do it for free. It's honestly super easy to create a free job post, and then all you do is add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. From there, simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates who have just the right skills and experience so that you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and ultimately hire. That's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering the quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Let's talk about that conference play. Let's talk about what the WCC looks like this year. Obviously, first year without BYU in the conference. They struggled last year. They certainly weren't the powerhouse program. that they had been earlier in their tenure during the WCC, but still a team that you don't want to see going out the door, especially if for a Gonzaga team that, they didn't replace them with anybody in the WCC. So they just kind of lost those opportunities. And right now, as we're recording, Santa Clara is a top 100 net team, but Portland is just outside the top 100 in the net. And frankly, the bottom half of the WCC, somewhat similar to what happens on the men's side, the bottom half of the WCC on the women's side is not good at all. Pepperdine is struggling. San Francisco's taken a big step back. St. Mary's, LMU, not particularly great programs. And really, it feels like Gonzaga is kind of stepping into a situation where they have to win every game. I mean, they really don't seem like there's any. I mean, maybe a road loss to Santa Clara doesn't kill you, but this is they're kind of entering territory where they got to start. They don't have a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah, you're right. And you talked about it. Like, you've got two other teams that are in the top 100, Pacific sitting at like the 140, 150 range, and then everybody else is like 180 or below. And when you talk about trying to seed yourself high, so Gonzaga's already got 13, right? And not to hurt, like not to disparage them, but going forward, not like winning games sometimes actually might hurt them. As crazy as it sounds, like, because the quality comes, like that's why Lisa Fortier schedules such a difficult non-conference, is because that's why their net ranking right now is so high, because then they can afford to play bad teams and then go down even if they win games. You're right. I think the advantage of like having Santa Clara at 64 and hopefully they can stay in that top 75, Portland can jump themselves back in the top 100, will help them. And the advantage of those two schools is they both beat Oregon, a Power 5 program, on the road I think Portland's game was at home, but again, in-state rivals by a large margin. So both those programs have very high quality wins. Santa Clara's 2 losses are to 2 other Power 5 programs. So they don't have a bad loss on their roster resume, because as a mid-major, right, you're not going to win every game against a Power 5. So having only Power 5 losses doesn't super hurt them. And that's why I think their net rating is so high. But then you're also saying, okay, Portland and Santa Clara need to pick up their remaining non-conference wins so that when we play them, and they can't falter to the bad teams in the WCC, right? Those other teams can't lose to the San Franciscos, the Pepperdines, the LMUs. They have to keep winning and be a challenger to us the rest of the way, so that way our wins over them look good, right? And that does help, right? Lisa Fortier talks about she wants the other coaches in the WCC to schedule harder. I think every WCC team had 2 to 3 Power 5 schools on their schedule at minimum, and winning 1 or 2 of those games for a couple of schools is really good, right? That looks much better on the record, when the resume, when you beat that school in WCC play. But they need to win all the games, because you're right, there's not a team there that's as good as them in terms of net rating. Nobody's in the top 50 even, right? So that's where, you can't lose to Santa Clara even on the road. And last year they lost to Santa Clara was like in the 150 to 200 range. So like, that's not as bad, but those are the losses you cannot afford. And you really can't afford any losses if you really want to be a top 16 team and host.
Well, let's talk about getting into that WCC season and what that's going to look like for Gonzaga, because we already talked about Yvonne Ejim, but we're going to talk about her again because, as Coach Fortier recently said in an interview, I want more people talking about Yvonne. Like, she is playing so incredible right now. And to me, looking at what is going to be the catalyst for this team that is balanced, that does have 5 scorers in double figures, that does have quality contributors coming off the bench, really a pretty pronounced 8-woman lineup rotation for them at this point. But at the end of the day, I mean, it starts with what Yvonne's doing down on the block. She's averaging 20 points per game, 8.7 boards, 2.7 assists. She's shooting 65% from the field. She's shooting 90%, just under 90% from the free throw line. Soft touch. Again, like you said, ability to get out in transition and score with her back to the basket. Just really tremendous stuff from her. And Gonzaga's development system that they've had, from Melody Kempton going from 6th Woman of the Year to an all WCC performer. Now Vonnie's doing the same thing. I'm sure there are players on Gonzaga's bench right now who are going to step into bigger roles in the future. But I guess the question is this: are WCC teams going to be able to figure out how to stop Vonnie? And is she the key for this team going undefeated the rest of the way and getting one of those top seeds in March?
She is definitely like at the top of every team scouting report. But I think the thing that makes this Gonzaga team dangerous is you can't help on anybody, because I talked about the other 4 starters. They all shoot the 3 ball at a very high level. Even I think Kaylee and Kaylin have been sort of down on that department, and Brenna to a little extent to start the year. It doesn't matter. They're all like 35, 36% shooters at worst. and they all have the ability to fill it up. And because I think this team doesn't, they don't care about who scores, right? Vonnie has 32 assists in 12 games. She's averaging almost 3 assists a game for a center, basically a power forward. And she doesn't, she has a good passing ability, but that's definitely not her strength. But it's just because she's starting to, again, like I said, the game's slowing down for her. She knows where other teams are going to come at her and make her life difficult. And I think she's doing a better job, doing a really good job of finding her teammates. And she's someone who's as happy for her teammates' success as she is for her own success, even maybe more happy for her teammates' success. So she doesn't really care, if she ends up with 10 and 5 assists, because that means she gave 5 other people a basket. She may end up having a triple-double one game just because she's just a willing passer. And I think the thing that doesn't get talked about a lot is her ability to rebound, right? Yeah. She's a great rebounder. She's almost averaging a double-double. And that's what other teams are going to really struggle with, because you can stop her first shot, but she's great at finding a second shot. And she's going to limit you to one shot. So you have to play almost perfectly against her. And yes, you may be able to slow her down offensively, but I just think with her combination of rebounding, scoring, and moving, being able to move and have good athleticism and passing, it makes other teams, they can't really load up on her just because of the other talent around her.
And I think too, a part of that you kind of touched on already, but that I think is really valuable is the continuity. Vonnie's a great passer, but part of the reason that she has developed into becoming a better passer and a more willing passer is because she's been playing with the same teammates for many years, and they're all back. Brenna obviously transferred in, so she's a little bit newer, but basically this entire group of 8 players who are contributing to this roster in a significant way have played together in multiple other college basketball seasons. They also played together this off season when they went on their trip overseas. They also played together, some of them in a 3-on-3 tournament earlier in the year. The Trunk twins went to the Southeast Asian Games and played in a 3-on-3 tournament there. Like, it just feels like this is a group of women who have played together so many times, so much basketball collectively, and in an era of college basketball where that's not as common. The transfer portal is impacting women's basketball in similar ways to how it's impacted other sports, and you're seeing less roster continuity, and certainly players are more likely to stick around longer on the women's side. But for this team to have as much experience as they have, to have as much continuity as they have, I struggle to see how teams in the WCC or even other teams are really figuring out, like, what do we do? Because there's so many different options for this team, and they're so familiar with each other and their styles and their coach, that it just feels like this team has this kind of really significant leg up going into basically every game.
Yeah, and I think, we talked about all this experience they have, and we talked about Yvonne, and we didn't even mention she played for her Canadian national team over the summer as well. So just more experience for her with high-level players against other, professionals. But I think you talk about it right. When I was doing my previews for for this conference in the Pac-12, Gonzaga was like 90% return rate and everything, in minutes, in points, in rebounding. And there wasn't another school in the WCC that, I think the next highest school I had in returning minutes was like 65%. So it just shows you when you've played together, and it's a credit to the job that Lisa Fortier and her staff have done, because you talked about it. How many kids do we see leave? Ioana Kermili, the best player, the leading scorer in the conference, transferred to Cal, right? You saw a ton of interconference transferring. You saw a bunch of high-level kids and a lot of conferences. Shaylee Gonzalez at BYU transferred to Texas. A lot of high-level kids transferring across the country, no matter the quality of the place that they're playing or not. They stuck it. They decided to come back. They decided to be a group. And I think part of that is the job that Lisa Fortier and her staff do. But part of it also was, I think they know the standard that Gonzaga has, right? It's a across the board standard for men's and women's basketball. And they did not live up to the standard last year, right? They were down. They didn't win the conference tournament, number one. Number two, they got bounced in a very bad way in the first round of the NCAA tournament against a very good Ole Miss team. And I think they said, no, we don't want to end our careers like that. We don't want this to be the note that we leave on Gonzaga basketball. And we are coming out this year to put everything we have on the line to win really important games, to win conference championships, to win conference tournaments, to put ourselves in the best possible spot to host the first and second round and put Gonzaga basketball on the map as a powerhouse every year. And I think that was really the mindset of the Krong twins, of Hollingsworth, and of Brenna Maxwell, and Ejim, who is also in her 4th year, could come back for another year. That 5 just like collectively was like, we're not going to end it like this. This is not the way this group of 5 people ends their career at Gonzaga. We are going to show up next year and we're going to be even better. We're going to enjoy our time together and we're going to put this program consistently on the map and make people talk about it.
All right, that's going to wrap us up for today. Thanks again to Matthew Walter for coming on the show. We got a big old preview of the UConn Huskies for Thursday and frankly for Friday's show. We're talking all things UConn hoops as we get ready for one of the biggest college basketball games of the season, certainly one of the biggest Gonzaga basketball games of the season coming up on Friday evening. Thanks so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Appreciate those of you who have joined us on our Discord channel as well. There is a link in the show notes if you are interested. It is free, and it is a conversation talking college hoops 24/7. Until next time, as always, go Zags.